takes a lot of courage to be a conservative on a college campus today.
We're at this place where everyone knows something's wrong. We need new thought leaders to come together.
I don't know that it's possible to say, well, we'll just retake America. I feel like that ship has sailed.
How can we go about curing the crisis of leadership that we faced in America?
All right, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed their first evening last night with us, and thank you for shuffling in this morning. So I'm looking forward to starting our panel, or our discussion rather, on how to thrive on a campus dominated by diversity, equity, and inclusion. Elizabeth Corey unfortunately couldn't make it because of the ice storms in Waco, Texas, but we have an awesome substitute. You heard from Josh Mitchell yesterday, and even better, some of you just came in this morning. So those of you who had not yet had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Josh Mitchell, now is your time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who I'll introduce both of them since some of you have not yet met Dr. Mitchell. So Dr. Jeff Polet is professor of political science at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He's the author of works in American political thought, contemporary European political thought, religion and politics, and constitutional law. Dr. Polet helps direct the academic program for the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, and he recently served as editor of the popular website Front Porch Republic. On the publishing side of late, he co-edited with David K. Ryden, Documents Decoded, Church and State in America from ABC CLIO. He doesn't care too much for movies, but thinks that the music of Gustav Mahler is as close as human beings get to expressing the ineffable, that God listens to Mozart in his spare time, and that Bach is history's greatest genius. Josh Mitchell is currently professor of political theory at Georgetown University. During the 2008-2010 academic years, Dr. Mitchell took leave from Georgetown and was the acting chancellor of the American University of Iraq, Soleimani. His research interest lies in the relationship between political thought and theology in the West. In addition to teaching at Georgetown University, Dr. Mitchell writes extensively about contemporary American politics and is an avid conservationist, committed to stewardship on a small farm on the Eastern Shore, and is working on the development of the next generation of solar electric sailboats. So please give it up for our speakers. So the subject we'll be discussing right now is, I want it to be kind of an extension of what Dr. Mitchell was talking about yesterday, but I also want it to offer you some practical advice and also an insight that perhaps you have not yet heard, which is the university through the lens of professors who perhaps you do not have any conservative professors at your university. I know I didn't at mine, at a public university. Others of you have had the fortune to have these faculty members at your fingertips. So whether you're from one side of the spectrum or the other, we kind of have representatives here from both sides of our educational institutions, because we have Josh Mitchell from Georgetown University, which is kind of has been in the middle of its own drama lately due to, at least at its law school level, and we have Jeff Polet from Hope College in Michigan, which is a Christian college, but it faces its own issues with DEI, which he probably mentioned over breakfast with us earlier at our table, and he'll talk more thoroughly about in this discussion. So I wanted to start by kind of setting the table for everyone. Clearly, DEI initiatives have influenced every school except some rare ones out there. Hillsdale, some other Christian conservative schools have kind of been insulated from it, but it's clearly proliferated, whether you've heard of it on the news, or you've seen it with your own eyes, or you've been impacted directly. So Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Polet, if you could give us kind of the lay of the land of what the situation looks like at your universities, at your colleges, and what your roles have been in just staving it off, or perhaps trying to lead students who are not going to succumb to the forces of DEI on their universities.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. So it's a complicated question, and obviously the landscape of American higher education has a lot of variety to it, or at least used to have a lot of variety to it. There have been all sorts of homogenizing forces probably the most significant of which is things that we might kind of lump into a sort of DEI complex. There are a number of variables and actors at play here, and they're hard to tease out on campuses. You mentioned Hillsdale as a sort of an exception, and Hillsdale can be an exception because they don't have to deal with federal funds. And so not only are you spared federal regulators, you're spared even more the accreditation complex on our campuses. And the accreditation complex is a kind of cabal of private reviewers who have control of federal funds as a way of leveraging institutions. So it's probably one of these things that students don't know too much about or pay too much attention to, but schools find themselves leveraged quite a bit by accreditation agencies, and the accreditation agencies are hardly neutral actors on our campuses. And they've been doing quite a bit to try to push colleges to become more aware about diversity issues. So when we had our last accreditation review, we got dinged by the accreditation agency, North Central is our accreditation agency, for cultural issues. And the main cultural issues, it's one of these really vague categories, right? I mean, you can include anything in cultural issues. And among these sorts of things were this remarkably vague term, cultural competency. And of course, if you're lacking cultural competency, that implies that you have cultural incompetency. And the way you become culturally competent is by undergoing these sort of mandatory training sessions. And that's where these sorts of things can really kick into gear. What you refer to as the DEI complex is they have access to the resources, and they'll use things like accreditation as a way of forcing faculty to engage in training sessions and so forth. So one of the things, then a second thing that you have to deal with on a campus such as Hope or Georgetown are legal requirements that they might have with regard to non-discrimination clauses and so forth. Now, one of the things I've discovered on my campus is that people will use accreditation reports and legal claims as a way of trying to promote a particular set of practices or a particular ideology. And what they never expect is someone to say to them, well, is that what the law actually requires? Or is that what the accreditation agency actually required? And they'll say, well, no, that's not really what the law requires. So, if you familiarize yourself with the law on some of these things and you get on a committee or something, sometimes all you have to do is say, well, it's not what the law says. And, but they'll have these really capacious readings of the law or of the accreditation reports as a way of accomplishing things that they otherwise might not be able to accomplish. So, this kind of combination of accreditation, the legal environment, one of the really interesting things that happened was when Betsy DeVos was Secretary of Education, and she just rolled back a number of the regulations that the Obama administration had put into place, which was important. I mean, the kind of rolling back of some of those requirements was an important part of campus life. Now they've been restored again, and due process has kind of gone by the wayside again as a result. So yeah, I guess the first thing I'll say in answer to your question, I'm sure we'll go into more detail about this, is that you do have a number of complex factors in place. Schools are responding to accreditation pressures. They're responding to legal pressures. They're scared to death of litigation. So if you talk to presidents and provosts and so forth, they fear litigation, and that actually could be useful. And they fear bad publicity. They really don't want any kind of publicity on their campus that makes it look like they're insufficiently sensitive to these things. So a lot of times, the sort of initiatives they put into place are prophylactic. They put them in there so they can say that they've done something, and that this is kind of an outlying event in case they get some bad publicity out of it.
Dr. Mitchell.
Georgetown has been hit particularly hard by this. First, a couple of larger observations. DEI is a Passover ritual. It's an attempt to make guilt pass over. There's a hope, forgive my language here, there's a hope among guilty white liberals that if there's enough diversity, equity, inclusion training, that in point of fact they can claim that they're not racist. I think that's a big part of what's going on. The other thing I would say is that a couple of things. So DEI, is ostensibly about diversity writ large, but it's a race that's driving this. After George Floyd, there was a huge number of DEI initiatives across campuses. And I'm going to say something more about this in a minute. I think race is the big question in America, and I think conservatives have shrunk from it. And I think we're not going to have an answer to DEI until we can think constructively about race, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But at Georgetown in particular, there's an additional issue which some of you know about, namely that in order to keep Georgetown afloat in the 1830s, they had slaves and sold them. And so there's tremendous guilt about that. Of course, this raises the question of reparations. So Georgetown is haunted by that. Many of my guilty white liberals have pressed hard on DEI. The government department where I am is pushing, some members of the government department are pushing something which they're calling a citizenship requirement. But if any of you know anything about the 1950s, these are loyalty tests. In the 1950s, during the communism or McCarthy era, there was concern that there were too many communists in the universities, and so they insisted, university presidents insisted that faculty signed loyalty oaths. This is the equivalent of a loyalty oath. What the Department of Government wants to do is to hire based on your commitment to DEI, give annual merit increases based on DEI, and give promotion and tenure based on your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is deeply, deeply troubling. Let me tell you how this plays out. So Georgetown has a huge portion of its staff that are black, and they're not paid well at all. So if you want to talk about, making things better for a portion of black America that is struggling, continues to struggle, this is obvious. But our department, in its infinite wisdom, which knew of this problem, we've paid our people very poorly, instead, what they did was they spent $5,000 or $10,000 to bring in some white woman from California to do diversity, equity, inclusion training. The staff did not lose sight of this. The staff knows full well that this is really about appeasing white guilt, so that social death will pass them by. If I may, just talk about race for a second and how I think we can and must address this. I'll repeat what I said before and what I said last night. Race is a problem in America. We cannot pretend that this is a colorblind society. We aspire to that. We are an immigrant society with the legacy of slavery. The problem has to be addressed. It is not clear to me that the only way to do this, in fact, it's quite clear to me that the state cannot do this, that the great mistake of the 1960s Great Society programs was to have the state step in as substitutes for the mediating institutions. There's a clear Tocquevillian resolution to this problem. I worked very closely with Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, Ian Rowe, with the Woodson Center and 1776 Unites. I would strongly recommend that you take a look at that. The 1776 Unites was invented in response to the 1619 Project. Bob and I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal on the occasion of Martin Luther King Day last year, and we said, look, if you look at the history of black political thought, you have huge differences. You have those who wanted to leave, those who wanted to fight, those who wanted to be loyal. But in all cases, up until recently, the understanding was that black America had agency. They could do something. The problem with the 1619 Project is that it supposes that the problem is systemic. That is to say, it's so large that only the state can help you, which is to say that black America is impotent. This is not true. And Bob's position, and you can go look up at his book, The Triumphs of Joseph, Bob's position is there's a biblical way to think through this, namely that you find the Josephs of each community who are doing things, who have been touched by grace. Bob says we don't need radical race grievance theory, we need radical grace theory. Because you find in all these communities, whether they're black, white, or whatever, you find people who've been transformed, who become the pillars of the community, and your obligation as a citizen is to find those people and to help them quietly. You're not broadcasting this and saying, see how good I am. No, you find the people who are actually doing things in their community. If conservatives do not have an answer to the race question in America, then DEI will roll over you. And DEI does not help Black America. It helps a narrow swath of Black America, the untouchables. And Black America consists of the untouchables and the disposables. We have to be very clear about this. This arrangement was worked out 50 years ago. It's why Bob Woodson left what he calls the race grievance industry. You've got one group that that you can't challenge the Al Sharptons of the world, and yet the other part of Black America, or another part, it's not clear how large, is the disposables, the ones who have to be permanently in a condition of need so that the state programs can grow and grow and grow. DEI helps no people in that standing. It helps only the blacks who are going to administer and the whites who are going to administer the DEI programs, and it blossoms the cost of administration in higher education. It's frankly repulsive because we have an obligation to help the least among us, black and white, and there are ways to do this within a Tocquevillian framework. Unless conservatives find a constructive way to address race, we can push back on the edges of DEI, but we have to have something positive to say.
So on that note, I would like to kind of talk about how you think that conservative students can navigate these types of atmospheres, given you think that their conservatives have not yet grappled with these issues sufficiently. How do you both, especially with, I guess, bringing everyone up to speed on what's unfolding at Georgetown University right now at the law school level regarding Ilya Shapiro and a tweet that landed him in trouble with the administration, and there has been some fallout at the student level among law students. So if both of you would like to go into more detail on what occurred there and your thoughts on it, and how conservative students are expected to thrive in that type of environment, or how they're supposed to find allies at the very least when this is what they're up against, and how you would, we'll talk more about practical tips for navigating it, but given that these are the circumstances, how do conservatives just zooming out at a larger scale even come to grapple at that at a, not just at the university level?
Well, let me tie that question together with what Josh was just saying. The students in the room probably aren't, or may not be familiar with the sort of historical conservative record on race matters, but it's not a particularly noble one. So one of the things I think that you have to do is grapple with that. And if you self-identify as a conservative, there are certain assumptions that are going to be made, and I don't think we're particularly well served by being defensive about those things. When Robin DiAngelo's book became a kind of sensation, after the death of George Floyd, it became kind of de rigueur. I was talking to some of my liberal friends on campus, and they loved the book. And I read the book. I just thought it was stupid. I mean, it's really badly written. I think it's a weak argument. I just thought, I can't see why anybody would be impressed by this book at both the philosophical level and the social scientific level. And so I was talking to my white liberal friends, and they loved the book. And I thought to myself, now why is it? And I think this is going to be my larger point, is to ask a kind of sympathetic engagement, right, an imaginative engagement. I began to ask myself, why is it that they think that this is a good book? It's not because they're stupid, and it's not because, and I think guilt plays an awful lot into it. But they can't see, otherwise competent social scientists would read that book, and they couldn't see all the social science flaws going on in that book. So I kind of asked myself, what's going on here? And I don't know if I'm right about this, but this is what I sort of concluded. For one thing, conservatives have been sort of used to being called racists. And so the sting of the word is not quite as intense for us as it might be for liberals who always thought they were on the right side of the race issue. And then as Josh talked about last night, suddenly the issue kind of turns on them a little bit because it's endemic, it's systemic, and so forth. And now they're dealing with guilt in a way they haven't really dealt with guilt before. I think a second thing that's going on is that conservatives have always been sort of comfortable with inequality. And liberals have not been comfortable with inequality, and so persistent inequality is a constant problem for them. And I think a third thing is having perceived themselves as being on the right side, not of just the race issue in America, but of history itself, and then things not working out exactly the way they planned, they were in this sort of state of permanent psychic distress. Robin DiAngelo's book is essentially a therapeutic book. And so it offers a kind of therapeutic regimen that they can engage in, which, and I think this would be interesting to explore in regards to the comments Josh made last night. If it's a therapeutic thing, it's about adjustment. Right? So you're constantly adjusting people to a kind of successful engagement with the system. If it's fundamentally a religious thing, then it becomes about grace and forgiveness. So what happens when you have some people thinking they're engaged in a therapeutic enterprise and other people thinking that they're engaged in fundamentally a religious enterprise? And that's especially the case when they're engaged in a religious enterprise where the forgiveness that is sought will never be offered. Right? So it's constant confession, constant supplication, with no possibility of forgiveness. And that's just going to drive people even crazier. And that would just ratchet things up in only one direction if they will never be offered the forgiveness that they're seeking. So I think that one of the things that I've tried to do on campus is just to ask people questions, when they bring up things. And sometimes it really annoys them. When after the death of George Floyd, there's on my campus, like many other campuses, these immediate public confessions. I was temporary chair at the time, and other departments in my division were issuing statements of confession, confessing to institutional racism, confessing to departmental racism. And my dean called me and said, "Will you be issuing a statement?" And I said, "No, we will not be issuing a statement." And he said, "Well, every other department's doing it." And I said, "Well, I think every other department's being stupid." Well, why won't you be issuing a statement? I said, "Well, first of all, because we don't have a problem with departmental racism. And second of all, it's not the habit of this department to comment on every news event of the day, to issue statements at those times." I said, "But I will say this. I've read some of these statements from other departments, and they were confessing to institutional and departmental racism. These were coming from the department chairs. Who's being held accountable? Right? If the chair of the Department of Psychology confesses that they've got a problem with departmental racism, then fire the chair of the Department of Psychology." And that's happening. This struck me also when I was reading the materials about the Shapiro case. Dean Trenner and some of these people in the law school at Georgetown, confessing to ongoing racism and insensitivity in the law school, and then fire him, or do the honorable thing and resign your position. But this isn't about accountability. This is about. That's why I think Josh's analysis is so smart. This is about Matthew 7. This is about praying on street corners.
Exactly.
And demonstrating to the world that you're a virtuous person and that you are a confessant, a penitent in the right sort of way. So there is this kind of public penitence that's taking place. My dean said to me, "Well, this is right after it happened." He goes, the racist murder of George Floyd. And I said, "Well, how do you know it was murder and how do you know it was racist?" And I got into trouble for asking these questions, and he goes, "Oh, this is just you being obstreperous again." That's his favorite word for me. And I said, "I'm not being obstreperous. I'm serious. Murder is a legal classification. There hasn't been a trial yet. We don't know all the facts. I was horrified by what I saw in the video. But two things I don't know for sure is whether Derek Chauvin's knee was the actual cause of death, and I don't know what was in Derek Chauvin's heart. You would have to make the argument to me that this could never have happened if it were a white perpetrator or a black police officer or something like that. I said, I'm not sure that you can make that argument. But they don't like those questions. So I just find that sometimes just not accepting things at face value, not obnoxiously or so forth, but just kind of saying, "Oh, that's interesting that you think that. So let me ask you this, why do you think that?" That's one way to get some purchase. But I think that Josh's assessment is right, that in some ways this really is about a kind of public display of penitential conduct. And so the worst thing that you can have when you're engaged in a religious ceremony are the blasphemers standing outside it. And that's, I think, sometimes the role that we get cast in, right? If you sit there and say, well, look, you're engaged in these sort of public rituals and so forth, and I see what's going on here. Well, now you're a blasphemer because you've sort of exposed the hollowness of the religious practices. And so the priests will cast you out.
Let me step up a level for a second. If you look at the Democratic Party and support for it, what you're finding is that Hispanics and Asians are starting to drop out, because what they're really tired with is the Democratic Party making everything about Black America. And nothing good is going to come of this. I'll come to this in a second. DEI doesn't actually solve problems. And there's a growing racial fatigue now in America. Look, you might remember a few years ago, it was Brett Kavanaugh and every man is a rapist. Remember this? And now it's race, and in a couple of years, it's already starting to happen. That issue's going to drop, and then it'll be climate change, which you can see it's already happening. It will be climate guilt, which we're all being subject to anyway. So I'm among those who say, well, I don't want the race issue to drop out. I actually want us to deal with this constructively. I don't want us to go through these phases where we have gender guilt, racial guilt, climate guilt, economic inequality guilt, which seems to be what's happening here. So I think we need to talk about race and do it right, and not have this Matthew 7. I'm glad Jeff brought this up, because that's exactly what's going on. The Democratic Party trots out race once every 4 years when they need to count on black support to vote, and then they forget about it. It's not an accident that all the things that happened before the election in 2020 happened. And now, nothing is going to happen in the next 4 years. The people in inner city Baltimore, the people south side Chicago, nothing good is going to happen in the next 4 years for them. And then the Democratic Party will say, look at all those Republicans, they're racist, we're the only ones who have your back, vote for us. And that's what's happened since the beginning of the Great Society program. So I do think we do need to talk about race. We can't let race fatigue set in, but that's exactly what DEI invites. I'm going to pick up something that Jeff said on the matter of the conservatives on race. Now, I keep telling my conservative friends, if you have nothing constructive to say, then you deserve the epithet racist. Listen, race is an issue, and if you have nothing to say, then people are going to presume that you're racist. It's really stupid, and it's not necessary. But let me go back to Goldwater for a second, because the argument that the conservatives made, it was a faithful argument in the 1960s, was they didn't say that many of them, the smarter ones, knew that race was an issue. It was obvious. But what they said was, this is a social issue, not a political issue. The government can't solve the problem. Barry Goldwater, who was tarred and feathered as a racist, had a black chief of staff who was not allowed, she was not allowed into the cafeteria, the Senate cafeteria. And he stormed down there and said, hell no, this is my chief of staff. So Goldwater was not a racist. But what they concluded, and it's a Tocquevillian insight, which I think is vindicated 60 years later, which is if the government steps in, what's going to happen is it's going to undermine all these institutions. Now, the mediating institutions, the government can and should step in as a supplement. So, yes, to the integration of University of Alabama. Yes, the government can step in and should step in, and this was King's position as well. But in the final analysis, government cannot be a substitute for the mediating institutions that every group, black and white, needs in America. The family and the churches, and the great pathology of the latest transgender push on the left is that it is basically accusing black men and women who believe in the church and the family that they're guilty of heteronormativity. I mean, this is sick, but that's what's happened on the left. So Goldwater, many conservatives did not say race was an issue. They said this can't be solved by the government. 60 years later, I think it's been more or less proven. On the matter of a colorblind society, we're not a colorblind society. You have two Phoenicians up here on stage, another one out in the audience, okay? We're proud of this, and I know many black Americans who say, we're happy being black. Bob Woodson said this right. He said, the opposite of segregation is not integration, it's desegregation. Meaning we're not all supposed to be the same, okay? What we're supposed to do is be able to move about as we choose. And I have Lebanese relatives who are still living in Worcester, okay? Grandfather's family came over in the 1890s. I think that's fine. The largest group of black Americans in one group is in Prince George County, just east of Washington. And I have a few friends there. They say, we want to live around people of our own kind. There's nothing wrong with that, folks. The problem is when we say, no, we all have to integrate completely. The opposite of segregation is not integration, it's desegregation. We have to keep this in mind. So there's nothing wrong with the kind of group affiliation. But what we have to be able to do is recognize that DEI in no way helps the least among us. And I think this is the phrase, it's the biblical phrase, you know, we have to use this phrase. And some portion of black America is the least among us, and a significant portion of white America is the least among us. That is our charge. And I think when you think about the free market and all that, we have to ask the question, how does this help the middle class and those who we want to join the middle class? The left talks about the poor, the poor, the poor. That's a code for more government programs for the poor to keep them in indentured condition. That should not be our position. Our position should be, we understand the problems of the poor, we will help the Josephs in the community through philanthropy, not through government programs, and we'll build an economy so that everybody can join the middle class. That's how we should be thinking about this.
So I want to use some of the Christian and just broadly religious language that you both have thoroughly cited. You know, Jeff, you asked, you mentioned blasphemers. So my question is, should students, and Josh, you just touched on this a little bit, but specifically in the role of students, they can face, obviously, wide-reaching consequences for being blasphemers on campus, whether that's, diminishing job prospects because of a tweet on social media or affiliation with a group on campus that perhaps doesn't have the right views. So my question is, should students be blasphemers? Should they be speaking out about these issues? Should they oppose DEI on campus? Or is there a way to do it that allows them to not perhaps self-censor, but also does not put them at risk of these other consequences? Or are those consequences something that comes with taking a stand?
Yeah, these are, I think, fairly complicated things. If you look at you brought the Shapiro thing at Georgetown. If you look at the Black Law Students Association website, the BLSA, they say a community of we are scholars, activists, and above all, a community. And I thought that was really interesting. And as a conservative, of course, I'm deeply committed to the idea of community and institutional life and so forth. And I think, I have sympathy for what Josh was just saying. People want to freely choose whom they associate with. these experiments in forced integration have failed. Experiments in desegregation have succeeded, but forced integration have failed. And a lot of these training sessions and so forth are really efforts at forced integration or forced homogenization. Now, practically speaking, on college campuses, Josh has talked quite a bit about institutional life, and we got institutional life in America being pinched from two sides. On the one side, you have the absorption of institutional functioning that's taking place, usually by government agencies. So think about family life, for example. One of the primary functions of the family is that it's supposed to be responsible for the caring of children, the raising of children, and the education of children. And then you have Terry McAuliffe running for governor of Virginia saying, hey, parents, no, right? We're not going to let parents have a role in their children's education. So what's happening, right? The state is absorbing a function of the family, and that vacates some of the authority of the family in the process. On the other side, you have this kind of doctrine of emancipation, right? That institutions are fundamentally oppressive, and that our happiness resides in being emancipated from these institutional restrictions. Tocqueville says in Democracy in America, there's been a lot of Tocqueville so far. One of the interesting things about Americans is their aversion to forms, he says. It's a really interesting observation. And I think this is in part what he's talking about, is the way that institutions articulate norms, form us. This is Yuval Levin's argument in his most recent book, A Time to Build. Right? They form us, and then they hold us accountable for how we conduct ourselves in those particular roles. But if we understand ourselves in primarily an emancipatory mode, we see these institutional forms as somehow oppressive, and we need to be liberated from them. So the result is you have a sort of vacating of institutional authority going on both sides. And it leads to an incredible weakening of our institutions. In some sense, the weaker the institution becomes, the more it's going to double down on coercive measures, because it won't have legitimate authority anymore. The only kind of authority it will have is coercive. And so what happens on college campuses, mandatory training sessions and things like this, right, where you are coercing people into certain modes of conduct. Having said that, I want to refer back to Levin's book again. It's titled A Time to Build. And there is a lot of opportunity here right now, precisely because these institutions are so weak. If you're enterprising and so forth, you can actually make some really interesting things happen on your campus. Through partnering with organizations such as ISI, you can build institutional networks on campus that operate as kind of counter institutions on college campuses. So I always say to students, your first task as a student is study and get your education. Then your second task is to be creative, right? To be constructive doing things. I go back to what Josh said just a minute ago. Being in a negative position all the time is just not helpful. Being in a adversarial position all the time is just not helpful. So I have Ian Rowe coming to campus next month, right? Rachel Ferguson is coming on Monday to talk about Black liberation through the marketplace, right? I mean, we're just doing things, and we're doing alternative things. And we're doing it on a small scale because I don't have, the people who are doing the DEI stuff, they have access to institutional resources, they have access to administrative resources, they have access to all kinds of institutional support and so forth. I don't have that, so I have to be entrepreneurial. I have to do that on the side, and we can do that. And it's a much smaller scale, but it really matters. And part of that is, Josh said last night that he's not advocating for the Benedict option sort of thing. and I agree with him, but there is a way to kind of keep the flame alive in these institutions. So a young woman who graduated from Hope 3 years ago, she is now studying, where do you send a kid to graduate school, right? Promising young undergrad to graduate school. Well, she is now studying with a former student of Josh's, Rick Avermenko, over at the University of Wisconsin, right? This is kind of like how you keep a thread going through the whole thing. And so, one of the things I would recommend to students is don't always get yourself in an adversarial position. Don't feel like you have to be fighting all these battles. Just try to do creative and constructive things. And that includes around, I think, these sorts of issues of race. You don't fight the problems of racial ideology with, either another racial ideology or with indifference. You fight it with a sensible, moral, humane vision of how the races are supposed to engage with one another.
Let me merely dovetail on what Jeff has wisely said here. So, and I'll do this by recurring to the great Plato. Maybe Aristotle had this method too, but I know Plato had this method. So when Plato's involved in a conversation, he's always taking the thread of what the conversation partner is saying, and he's not doing this. He's saying, okay, well, let's see where that goes. Let's follow it all the way and see where it goes. If you're dialectical, you're not pro and anti, and I think this language of pro and anti, I think we need to stop it. So now let me come down a bit to the question of identity politics and DEI. So I don't oppose identity politics. What I say is you who believe in this are carrying crumbs away from the feast. The feast is what Christianity declares about the scapegoat, about the innocent one. You're feasting on crumbs. Let me show you where this really goes. Microaggressions and unconscious bias. Look, if you understand anything about the brokenness of Adam, you will say, well, this is the crumbs of the Christian insight about the brokenness of man. Come unto me. You guys must be starving. Let me show you where this really goes. And then with respect to DEI, don't say, well, we live in a colorblind society. Don't oppose it. Just ask the question, well, so tell me how this is actually helping the least among us. I can see how it's going to build a bureaucracy where you're going to bring in blacks and whites in the DEI administration, and they're going to make you feel guilty and give you atonement. I can see how that's going to happen. But tell me how this helps the least among us in Washington's Northeast or in just north of Hyde Park in Chicago. Tell me how it helps. Because I believe that the race question is a big one. I just don't see how this actually helps address the problem. So don't push back, go further. Go into what they're doing and show that it's not adequate. It's feasting on crumbs. That's the way you win.
Yeah, defunding the police is sort of an example of that, right?
Yeah.
Tell me how that helps the people on the south and the west side of Chicago.
Yeah.
Right? Because they sure don't want the police defunded, right? They want more of them.
Some of you may have seen the Wall Street Journal op-ed by Sylvia Bennett Stone just the other day. I don't remember the exact name of the organization. It's now a national organization of mothers who've lost children to violence in the inner city. She said, enough of, to use Bob's language, I keep coming back to it, guilty white liberals who live in distant zip codes. Right? I mean, they defund the police from the safety of their neighborhoods. If you want to solve the problems of these regions of the city, you have to go to the people who are living there and say, how can we solve the problem? And if you look at surveys of what blacks want with respect to police protection, it's overwhelming. It's 80%. They want strong police protection in those regions. It's guilty white liberals who say defund the police. So you have to press this further and say, how is this helping, and here's my phrase again, the least among us? That should be the criteria. Quickly,
look, conservatives are committed to free markets, but we have to be very clear that the free market alone will never solve our problems. It's free markets, it's mediating institutions, and it's philanthropy. You have to have this ability to give to address the problems that the market can't quite solve all the time. And so philanthropy has to be part of this. And the project of the Josephs, Bob Woodson's project, I mean, it tells us all that we need to be the pharaohs who find the Josephs of every community and help them quietly. That's how we fix this problem.
You know, I think one of the things we're both touching on here is that the way we talk about race is way too unidimensional. We're almost getting into a one-drop rule about how we discuss race in this country. None of us want to be viewed unidimensionally. We're all multidimensional creatures, and we want to be viewed multidimensionally. And the only way we come to understand one another multidimensionally is by engaging one another. I have a lot of objections to the use of the word equity. So, you know, Josh and I have been around for a while, and we've seen jargon come and jargon go in the academy. And you know, every now and then there's a word that just kind of pops up, and suddenly everybody's using it all the time. You know, robust or nimble or agile, or and now it's been equity for the last couple of years. And maybe some of you have seen this little cartoon where they have the people outside the baseball game. I'm seeing some heads nod, yeah. Right, they're out, there's a baseball game going on, and you have a tall person, a medium height person, and a short person. There's some boxes and so forth, and they're watching the game. And it's, for my money, a real bad cartoon for also, not only because they're free riders, but because there are hidden actors in the picture that we're really not supposed to be paying attention to. But one of my objections to that cartoon is the three characters in the three main characters that we notice. We're not really looking at the baseball players or the owners or, God forbid, the fence builders. They have their backs to us. We can't even see their faces. So we are invited to think about them in terms of one quality alone, and that's their height, right? And that becomes now the sort of defining quality. I suppose that's one of my objections to this is, you know, when I talk to black colleagues or black students, absolutely they run into racism in their lives, and it's a serious problem. But I haven't talked to any of them yet who want to be understood so unidimensionally. You know, so I think there is, if we're engaged in this sort of creative project of trying to understand one another multidimensionally, that means we have to build relationships. And you have to be kind of, I think, clever, not clever in a conniving way, but smart, wise about how you do this. So, for example, I'm teaching an American government class this semester, and I have a young black woman in the class, and she was wearing a stocking cap in class, and I was sort of in the back of the room, I couldn't see it. But afterwards, I ran into her in the hallway, and I saw on the front of her stocking cap, she had something stitched on there, and I kind of squint to see what it says, and it says, I don't fornicate with Republicans, except it didn't say fornicate with. It did begin with an F, but it didn't say fornicate with. And I kind of looked at the hat, and I did a double take, and I said, so let me ask you this. Why'd you buy that hat? And then she was kind of, you know, brought up short by the question a little bit, and she kind of explained to me, you know, I don't like Republicans. I said, that's fine, right? It's okay. But why'd you buy that hat? So we had a little conversation about it. I said, so let me ask you this question. Why do you think it's permissible or acceptable for you to be wearing that hat on a Christian college campus? I'm not saying that you should be doing that with Republicans. I'm saying that you shouldn't be wearing a hat that has that word on it on a Christian college campus. So. But by that point, we had been in a conversation for about 10 minutes. Now, if I had just confronted her, I would have alienated her, and I would have alienated her in my class. I'm confident she's not a conservative, but I fairly confident. But you know what? I have events. Every fall, I take a group of students up to the Russell Kirk Center in Mecosta, Michigan, and I have students from across the political spectrum who come to the center with me for the weekend, and I have students who are pretty far left in their politics and so forth, who are begging me to make sure I organize it on a weekend when they can attend, because we're giving them real substance and real education. I'm not beating them over the head with an ideology, or I'm not beating them over the head with politics or something like that. We're building relationships. We're engaging in conversations. They're being listened to. Every human being wants to be listened to. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be understood. I think that's pretty fundamental to who we are, and obviously Tocqueville has a lot to say about this as well. So, this goes back to, don't be too adversarial, because you never know who you can build a relationship with, and you never know how your life is going to be enriched by that, or how that person's life is going to be enriched by that. And that's how we make progress.
So, Dr. Mitchell, if you'd like to add a remark before we switch to our Q&A session.
I taught in the Middle East off and on for 15 years. And maybe 5-6 years ago, a woman in a hijab came in during my office hours. And she said in adequate English, she said, "Professor Mitchell, why are your colleagues telling me I have an identity? I'm a Muslim. Why do I have to have an identity?" And identity is one of these words. It's like equity. It's recent, and I keep telling my students, 50 years from now, your children will laugh at you because they'll say, "Why were you talking in these terms?" So what happened on that campus was all of these students who had never heretofore known that they had an identity are now running around trying to figure out what identity they have, and forming identity groups. And of course, the essence of identity politics is that it provides an intersectional score on the basis of which you can assess who you are and where you stand. And we want to have these markers. We want to know in advance what we're dealing with. Tocqueville saw this. It's precisely the fragility of the soul in the democratic age, without markers, without formalities, that leads us to want to find quick and easy ways to figure out who we are and who they are. And the advantage of identity politics is it's very clear. So if you're a white man, you're here. If you're a woman, here. If you're gay, if you're black, and then there's the intersectional stuff that people are trying to. But the point is, it's an entire moral vocabulary or hierarchy which allows you to assess exactly where you are. And there's a sick comfort in that, gang. There's a sick comfort in that. But what Jeff and I are up here saying is that human relations exceed that. We might start that way. We're going to meet each other face to face and make provisional judgments, but the question is whether we're going to rest with those or whether we're going to do something more. And as I said to you last night, Tocqueville thought that democracy unleashes an energy never before seen in human civilization. But the way it does that is by you and I engaging one another and immediately, because we have to work together, exceeding the judgments and the imaginings that we have of who the other person is. That's what you should be offering to a world which is frightened, exhausted, feels full of impotence. You can say that there's a way forward, that this identity thing is a stop on communication rather than a first hurdle that we have to get over and get past. So you have to go out there and say, we're living this impoverished life. We can do better. You want more, but what you're doing is not giving you the nourishment that you need.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you, Dr. Polet. Please give them a round of applause for their remarks. So we will now be switching to a Q&A session, so please take some time with your table, think of some questions that you'd like to ask either one or both professors on stage, and then you can line up at the microphone right over here and we'll begin taking questions in a few minutes.
I have a question for Dr. Mitchell. So with regard to your kind of plan for, I guess, helping the Josephs in communities, how do we go about promoting kind of the mediating institution solution to race issues not involving state government or federal government in the solutions? How do we go about promoting mediating institutions in a way that people see as an actual solution and they see kind of how that manifests, how to put that into action, instead of, like, I feel like as conservatives, if we just say the solution is at the individual level or at the local level, a lot of people who see every solution as being at the state level say that's just us, that's just empty words, and that's not going to be translated into action. So how do we, I guess, lay out the plan for how that can manifest at the local level through mediating institutions, especially for people who won't accept something like the church as an acceptable mediating institution for putting that into practice?
Well, thank you. On the religious issue, I agree, where Americans have found their church, it's called identity politics. And as long as they're doing that, the churches aren't going to have much to say. So one of the questions I always pose to my friends on the left is, how's that working for you? And I think it's a question we should all ask. How's that working for you? And in the context of the pushback that you're going to get, well, we can't work locally, we have to work at the national level. The question is, how's that working for you? There have been two groups historically in America that have been in the receivership, or some portion of them have been in the receivership of the state. It's the American Indians and Black America. Marriage rates in Black America were on par with marriage rates of white America in the 1950s. And now out of wedlock birth rates are just staggeringly high. It's quite clear that while the state promises much, this is exactly what Tocqueville said, the state will always promise much, but the complexity of human life always exceeds the capacity of the state to drill down and to solve the problems that it finds. So what I think we have to be careful of is being anti-state. Don't be anti-state. The issue, we have to think very carefully about this. It's not big government, it's small government. It's government as a supplement to the mediating institutions, not a substitute for them. And I think we're in a good position after 60 years of the Great Society program and several $1 trillion. We're in a good position to say, how's that working for you? It's not. There's a group of Black Americans who remain in receivership. I call them the disposables. It's terrible, but it is necessary for them to be in this permanent condition in order for people to say, see, we need more state programs. And Martin Luther King was really clear on this. King was formed through generations of the churches where he grew up and through an intact family. That's what made Martin Luther King. So we don't want to be anti-state, but we want to say the state can supplement but not substitute. And for the last 60 years, it has substituted for, and it's just not working. Now, it's going to take a long time to turn this around, but it's quite clear that the state can't do what it promises to do.
So, Dr. Polet, you talked about being constructive rather than adversarial. But a problem I think people run into, especially at small colleges, is that even conservative students are afraid to associate with conservative organizations as a result of social pressure. And I'm curious how you think we should mobilize that segment of the student body.
Well, courage is a virtue. So there's always this kind of cultivation of the intellectual and the moral virtues, and on college such as mine, hopefully the theological virtues as well. A lot of times these powers look more daunting and powerful than they are, and what they don't deal well with is pushback. Right, and again, I'm not saying just, being, in this kind of fighting mode all the time. I've taken to, when I get pressured to do something, to simply asking the question, what happens if I don't? I'm not saying I'm not going to. I'm not even saying it's a bad idea. I just want to know what happens if I don't. And then I get these kind of curious looks, and they're like, well, but we're asking you to do this. I said, I understand, but what happens if I don't? A lot of times these kinds of practices and so forth look more intimidating and powerful than they really are. So I understand when, Josh has used the phrase social death. When you're 18, 19, 20 years old, that's a different proposition than when you're my age and you're married and you have kids. And, I don't worry about social death that much anymore. But when I was 20, I sure did. Obviously you have careers you have to worry about also. So I would say, you have to have a network in place. You have to have support. None of us can do these things on our own. Associating with like-minded people is not just smart, or courageous, it's essential. You have to do something like that. But be prudent, which is also a virtue in how you go about these things. Ilya Shapiro, right, what did he do? He went on Twitter, right? I mean, why anybody will tweet anything in this world is just absolutely beyond me. You're just asking for trouble. And it wasn't an artful tweet at best, but stay off of social media. Stick to your studies, stick to your communities, build friendships, and build relationships, and then I don't know. This isn't helpful, but just don't worry too much about it. I think in a lot of ways, unless they've been able to mobilize these kind of popular media things against you, in my experience, at least, they're just not as powerful as or intimidating as they look.
May I add something on that? I teach at Georgetown, but I'm also restoring an old farmhouse. And I will tell you, the conversations I have at Georgetown are entirely different than the conversations I have with my carpenter, my plumber, my electrician. And I get more fortification from, it's actually a mixed race crew in all the cases, having those conversations, because those guys know what reality is. Mm-hmm. So you need to have your feet firmly planted on the ground, and that means all of your life can't just be university. Go out and find plumbers and carpenters to talk to, because they understand you.
And I want to say something additional to that. There is on my campus, and when I talk to people at other campuses, an acknowledged crisis of manhood going on. We have declining numbers of men going to campuses, and the ones who are going to campuses feel emasculated in many ways. So a couple of my colleagues and I decided to do something countercultural, and that's create a men's group. And we are doing things such as teaching them how to sweat copper, teaching them how to run an electrical line, teaching them how to rebuild an engine. So if you've read Matthew Crawford's book, The World Outside Your Head, one of the things he talks about is that we try to create a frictionless world. And the campus is a kind of, in some ways, a sort of frictionless world because you're not running into things that resist your efforts, that push back against you. And you're not engaged in reality, right? You're just kind of completely lost inside your head. One of the things, I'm with Josh, I would much rather have a conversation with plumbers and electricians, people who actually know how to do things. They're more interesting because they're engaged in reality in a way that my colleagues aren't. My colleagues are really boring. I just don't find them interesting people. And part of that is this sort of engagement with reality. So I think that's really enormously important advice. On our campus, we talk a lot about, the knowledge and skills, but we're not teaching them actual knowledge or actual skills. Like if we would have our students grow a garden, and have to deal with pests and weeds and, get on their knees and pull, that would do them a lot more good than yet another diversity training session would.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
So I think you made some really interesting points about having an attitude towards social pressure and how it's not as powerful as you maybe think it is. But, how do we as leaders of conservative societies not just tell, but convince people in the student body to think that way as well?
Well, I'll go back to what Josh said about Plato. You don't go into a conversation trying to convince someone. Conversations are supposed to be open-ended processes. So if you're engaging someone in a dialogue with the intent to win, you've destroyed the whole dynamic of the dialogue itself. The dynamic of the dialogue is learning and mutual discovery, and teasing things out and drawing things out. Michael Oakeshott said, conversation is like gambling. It's not in winning or losing, it's in the wagering. Now, that doesn't exactly answer your question, which is that at least you have to be able to make the case that you have, that you're entitled to a position in the dialogue. That's what I take you to be saying, right? That in some ways you feel like you're being shut down and that you're not even allowed to participate in the dialogue. I expect we'll be hearing more about this later today, but I would say two things in that regard. One, we undercut our position as conservatives when we engage in unnecessary flame throwing. So there are certain organizations I won't work with because I think they're just trying too hard to be provocateurs, and I don't think that helps anyone. The second thing is, I'm going to have three things actually. The second thing is that I think some of this is going to get sorted out through lawsuits. And I think litigation is I'm not saying that you start litigating, but there are certain circumstances under which litigation is a reasonable strategy. A third thing is, and this is what I've discovered accidentally in the last couple of years, there are donors who are interested. So I've discovered that I'm better off not working inside the college, but working alongside the college. I try to give the college itself as little control over the finances of, I have a group called the Tocqueville Forum that I do on campus. And I have to run it through a college budget, but I am the only person who can pull money out of that budget. And I just don't let the college have any control of those resources. And there's a lot of conservative groups that have done stuff like this. You don't work inside the college, you work alongside the college. But then you can actually do some really interesting and creative things without the kind of pressures and limitations being placed upon you.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, how do you balance the virtue of courage and like the long game of forming relationships in order to get new members?
So how do you recruit? Well, people join communities for different reasons, but one reason why they'll join communities is because it's attractive to them. And so I think one of the things that conservatives do well and can do well is to build attractive communities. And I think self-sufficiency, and actually engaging in good projects. I mean, what Josh was saying about, actually helping people. There is absolutely no reason why conservatives shouldn't be involved in something like Habitat for Humanity, and going into some of these places and building houses for people. In Holland, we've got this thing called Jubilee Ministries. They refurbish these old buildings and so forth. Bring your group there, get engaged. One of the things, with our men's group, the way we organize it, the way we do, is that men do better conversing with each other when they're engaged in a project or when they're doing something. They don't, like putting them across the table from each other in face-to-face conversations, men are a little squirrely with that, right? But if, right, you get them, hoeing a garden together side by side, then they'll talk to each other. So I get into conversations I wanted otherwise. But I think we have to build attractive communities. Angry communities are not attractive communities. Aggrieved communities are not attractive communities. I worry sometimes that the conservative movement in America is developing its own victimization complex. And I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's constructive. And I think we'd be well advised not to pursue that route. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
At my university, I was in a class of, so I'm part of this program with the university called Presidential Scholars, and with that program we have to take a class, we're forced to take a class, and I was pretty much the only vocal conservative in this class, so you kind of know how it's going to go. And we were forced to read a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, who is a known communist, very big supporter of critical theory. And the class was centered around essentially instilling these Freirean ideals within students. And one of those was about the relationship between the professor and the students, and like how in his mind the learning happens with the students and the dialogue that happens with the students, and not as much with the teacher. But I was wondering how, in that sense, like we as conservatives can stand up against this onslaught of, like if we're in a room that is very, very much against us, how we can stand up against a professor who is not on our side and doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand our point of view, and a bunch of students who similarly do not want to understand our point of view. I wasn't the only conservative in the class. There were some other conservatives. They just weren't vocal, because it was pretty hard to be vocal conservative. So what would you say, I guess, firstly, should be the relationship between the professor and the students, and what should the learning in the classroom look like? And then secondly, how can we as conservatives hold our own in an onslaught of just crazy, leftist just indoctrination, essentially, is what it was?
I'll take a stab at both those. I don't know if you're going to think less of me or more of me after I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I believe that so-called student-centered learning has been a catastrophe. Back in the 90s, when we started having student evaluations of professors' classes, I thought, no, that's the beginning of the end. Forget it. We're going toward the Lord of the Flies as soon as we move in this direction. So my view is that getting a PhD and working for 40 years and losing a lot of sleep over how to think about Plato through Nietzsche, the canon of Western political theory, that's a lot of work. And that means that we need to count on professors who've done that to be teachers, to have a kind of suppleness of mind, agility of mind, to be able to guide conversations. I don't want to go into a room and this is where I completely disagree with St. John's. I don't want to go into a room and say, well, so what do you think? I need to figure out what students are thinking. So I threw away my lecture notes 40 years ago, by the way. I threw away the first year because I walk into a room of 100 people and I read the room and I start talking and then I kind of pay attention. It's an improv. Real teaching is an improv. But I think teachers have an immense responsibility for that, and the movement towards student-centered learning has been a catastrophe. That's the first thing I'll say. And then on the matter of how you speak up in a classroom, I continue to believe, as I said a few minutes ago, that you have to ask the question, how's that working for you? You just have to, it's not oppositional. It's, okay, let's follow this through. Marx, gosh, I teach the Communist Manifesto, and I have for a very long time. It's a brilliant failure. It's a brilliant failure, though, and you have to understand how it could possibly have been appealing, but you have to ask the question, so where did this go? Where does this lead? And you have to be able to show that people will not change their minds until they realize that the thought they have leads to catastrophe. That is your goal then, is to show the thought leads to catastrophe. Let me add one other thing. Just take a couple minutes here. I'm hearing a variant of the following question from a number of you. When people don't listen, what are you going to do? Now, I've only recently, strangely enough, been serious about Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. I teach it in a course on conservatives and radicals, but I actually only teach a few sections of it. And I think the most brilliant section, which speaks volumes to the crisis conservatives have, is that section in which he distinguishes between the excellence of simplicity and the excellence of composition. And he says, if you're operating in the left, the revolutionary frame of mind is the excellence of simplicity. There's one thing we need to do, and only one thing. We need to bring about the universal rights of man, the French Revolution. There's one thing and only one thing we need to do. We need to solve the problem of class tyranny. There's one thing and only one thing we need to do. We need to bring about identity politics justice. There's one thing and only one thing we need to do. We need to solve the COVID crisis. And everything else gets thrown out in order to solve the one problem. Under the elegance of composition, and this is the conservative mind, what you understand is that there's never-ending trade-offs. In Tocqueville's language, the aristocrat understood that the project of life is amelioration, not change. So if you're conservative and you have internalized this, and Jeff mentioned Michael Oakeshott, and years ago we were in Liberty Fund conversations where Michael Oakeshott was a key player, and he understood this, and Burke understood this. Once you get to the place where you're operating under the excellence of composition, and you know life is constant trade-off, you're going to walk around and see people who are working under the elegance of simplicity, and you're going to say, oh my God, this is a different species. And it's really difficult to get people to move from thinking in terms of the excellence of simplicity to the excellence of composition. That is what makes a conservative, gang. It's that you understand there's no magic bullet solution to any problem. There's no magic solution to the problem of race. There's no magic solution to the problem of men and women. There's no magic bullet. It's this constant balancing act, and that's a frame of mind. Burke saw it very clearly. He's the first one to identify the revolutionary frame of mind as being oriented by the excellence of simplicity, and it's with us right to the present day. That's the big battle.
Thank you. But I want to say something about your question also, and this is a thing I want to caution all students about. The first obligation of a reader is to understand what he or she is reading. Whatever the text happens to be, whatever the book happens to be, your first obligation is to understand the author's argument, not to prejudge it too much, and not to view it in such a way that you can't learn anything from it. Marx is an interesting example of that. If you can't read Marx to profit, then you're not a good reader. There's an awful lot in Marx that is worthy of our attention. And not just the mistakes he makes, but some of he's engaged in reality. Right, you can, Josh was talking about Nietzsche a lot last night. Well, I'm not a Nietzschean, but man, have I learned a lot from Nietzsche. Yeah. Have I learned a lot from Freud? So I would caution you against sort of approaching the history of thought with white hats and dark hats and saying, so-and-so is not worthy of my attention. Now, you mentioned Paulo Freire. Elizabeth Corey and I had an article recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education on diversity training sessions. And we begin the article with a quotation from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We sort of used the book to push back against these training sessions. And it was Elizabeth was the one who came up with that. It was a pretty deft rhetorical move. Because one of the things that you have to be able to do, understanding is in part the art of translation. You have to be able to take what is sensible in your world and make that sensible in somebody else's world through the mediation of language. And so anytime we're engaged in understanding, we're engaged in a kind of translation of sorts. And so, view those kinds of things as an opportunity to expand your vocabulary, right? I mean, will this enable me to kind of, translate my ideas? You don't have to buy it, but don't assume that it's really not worthy of your attention either. Never assume that a book that's being assigned is not worthy of your attention. After you've read it, you might say to yourself, "Oh, that was a pretty bad book." But like with Robin DiAngelo's book, I didn't feel like I could pass a judgment on the book until I actually read the thing. And after I read it, I said, "Yeah, it's a pretty bad book." So that's one thing. And the second thing is you use the phrase "standing up to the professors" or "standing up to these ideas" and so forth. And again, I would caution against this idea that this is your task right now. I mean, I understand there are professors who are not doing their jobs. Going back to what Josh was just saying, there are plenty of professors on my campus who just aren't doing their jobs. And one of the things I say to our administrators, and this is Plato also, polypragmasune in Plato, right? People need to do what they were paid to do. If you were paid to teach chemistry, don't spend the first 20 minutes of your class talking about Donald Trump. Right? And this is what's happening. And there has to be accountability for that. So that's where I think students can do things such as go to the department chair or go to the dean or something like that and say, "I'm spending all this money, to learn organic chemistry, and I have to listen to somebody whining for 20 minutes about Donald Trump." So I think there is a pushback position, but it's all about whether people are doing their jobs properly or not, and whether they're being held accountable for doing their jobs properly.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
May I add, just since we're going along this line? So on the matter of, I take this to be, in some measure, a discussion of the importance of formality. So 2 weeks ago, I was down, actually right across the state, at a gala event, and Jordan Peterson was the keynote speaker. And he's a genius. He's very troubled. It's not clear he's going to make it. But I asked the first question. It was a very probing question. And he got upset with it. Now, he was the speaker, and I was just a questioner. I could have said lots of things. He pushed back, and I let him have the floor because he's the speaker. I could have escalated it. I didn't. And I think in a classroom, you have to understand that you're going to have, I remember this from the University of Michigan, look, you're going to have terrible teachers. It took me 6.5 years to get through my undergraduate degree because I would go crazy after a semester and go off and be a carpenter. So it took me 6.5 years because I couldn't stand, but I understood that, yeah, that's the professor, and you're going to have to figure that out. That's the first thing. Second, let me come back to Marx for a second. One of my favorite passages in the Communist Manifesto was late in it, when he talks about bourgeois socialism. Because bourgeois socialism is social justice, gang. And the left, we're Marxists, and I show them this passage, and I say, no, you're not Marxists, you're bourgeois socialists. What you want to do is you want to keep capitalism intact, but you want to skim off in the name of social justice. And Marx has contempt for you, because his view is you have to get through the stage of capitalism entirely, and only weak and cowardly souls back down and rest with bourgeois socialism. This is completely eye-opening to them. So again, you show them where things really go. They say they're Marxist, but no one has the stomach to be a Marxist. You wouldn't be a student if you're a Marxist. You'd be a revolutionary. So it's very helpful to illuminate these texts that they think that they understand, and to show that, in point of fact, no, they have a very flaccid understanding of these books.
That's very helpful. Thank you guys so much.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to switch over for the refreshment break. So whoever wants to approach the mic.
So first, I would like to say that I am very fortunate to go to a Christian conservative college, so I don't really deal with the daily. having these discussions with progressives or liberals. But my question is, how do we go about discussing these ideas with the ignorant ally, with the conservative who doesn't really understand why they believe what they believe, but is nonetheless incredibly vocal about what they believe?
The ignorant ally, huh? I haven't heard that term before. What school are you at, by the way?
Blue Mountain College.
Okay, yeah. I think one theme that we're touching upon here in different ways that hasn't been fully articulated yet is a theme of a kind of intellectual humility. And I think this is, one of the things that I get frustrated with my really vocal leftist students is a kind of lack of intellectual humility, or some of my colleagues is a lack of intellectual humility. There was something that happened not long ago. I got into a dust-up with somebody about something, and they projected as to what my reaction would be in a certain circumstance. I said, "How could you possibly know that?" And this is a thing that comes up all the time. People are making sorts of assumptions about things, and nobody pushes them back on the assumptions. When I was reading the interaction between the BLSA and the deans at Georgetown, I thought there were some legitimate claims that the BLSA was making. I thought there were some completely ridiculous claims that they were making, but nobody was pushing them back on it. Right, so I think it's a kind of gentle questioning that you have to engage in, and in both parts, because there's a sort of lack of intellectual humility that can kick in. So I have not heard, what'd you call it again? Ignorant?
The ignorant ally.
Ignorant ally, yeah, so that's my brother. And having conversations with him can be just an absolutely exasperating experience. And but part of what I'm constantly trying to do is challenge some of his assumptions and kind of push back. And it's difficult because people who are revolutionaries, people who are activists and so forth, sort of by the definition of the thing, they don't want to see complexity. This is why plumbing and carpentry matters, is because it teaches you complexity, it teaches you the difficulties involved in making things hang together and look good, and so forth. But the ignorant allies, as you call them, are simplifiers in their own way. So I think there's a kind of gentle questioning that you engage in to try to introduce some intellectual humility. A second thing, and Josh and I were talking about this a little earlier, is I think the main crisis on our campuses right now is a crisis of language. To use Orwell's expression, we are letting our words choose our meanings and not our meanings choose our words. And an awful lot of time, if I just say to somebody, okay, so tell me exactly what you mean by that. Like when you say that, they're like, well, they don't really know what they mean by it. And they resort to cliches or something like this. So like, no. So I think we should be constantly engaged in the search for meaning, and letting our meanings choose our words, to be careful about our words, to think about how our language is being used and so forth. And I think that would go with anyone, including ourselves. I find writing a difficult task in part because it's so easy to start lapsing into kind of set phrases or pre-established patterns of writing or something like that. And if you're constantly thinking, I need to let my meanings choose my words, it's a difficult task. But it's the only way we get anywhere on stuff. Otherwise, like Orwell says, Words are just like a snowfall that's falling on everything and obscuring the outline of everything in the world. And I think we're just adrift right now in sloppy language usage and bad meaning.
Let me add to that. So I teach Plato through Nietzsche, but I think the passage I'm most haunted by in all of the history of Western political thought is the opening line of the Republic. I went down yesterday to the Piraeus with Glaucon. Why? Well, going down, in the Republic, in the allegory of the cave, after the allegory is described, Plato says, so down you must go to participate in the two ways of life. And so the opening line of the Republic corresponds to that passage in the allegory of the cave, where he says, down you must go. Well, what is the cave? It's, to Jeff's point about language, it's all these passing shadows. And your ignorant allies and even your thoughtful ones are going to get caught and entrapped by the passing shadows. And the passing shadows, it's identity, for us it was other things 40 years ago. Pay attention to the words you are using and other people are using. And I have to say, I'm an old guy now. There's tremendous solace in having a kind of clarity of mind and seeing that other people are being driven by shadows and lost in illusions. But there's also, I'm going to tell you this, there's also a kind of solitude and loneliness in this too. And you have to decide whether you're going to have the stomach and the courage, because the cost of clarity is a kind of separation. And there's always going to be a tension between philosophy and the city, so to speak, between those who are working with slogans. And that raises all sorts of questions about how you, as a thinker who attempts to find truth, is going to descend to the level of politics, which is often the level of slogans. Now, my own conclusion is that we have to do this as well, because we have to participate in the two ways of life, as Plato says, both the eternal order and the world of time. But there will always be a tension. And so that problem that you're describing will never go away. And that's why Socrates is just so incredibly interesting, because there is never a place in the Republic or in any of his writings where he despairs. Never. There's Socratic cheerfulness. This is why Nietzsche hated him. There's Socratic cheerfulness. He knows he's living in a world of shadows and of misunderstanding, and yet he's always cheerful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you, Dr. Polet.
Thank you, Mike.